Welcome, welcome, everyone. So let's make a start then on this really, really exciting day for us all here at the Florence Nightingale Foundation. My name is Gemma Stacey and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of the Florence Nightingale Foundation. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to this webinar today, where we will be launching our really wonderful book around the health and wellbeing at work for nurses and midwives. I'm joined today by my co-editor, Holly Blake, and Holly and I have worked together for many, many years and have focused our attention and energy on this very, very topic. But for many years, we've been part of a small group of academics and clinicians and practitioners that have really been trying to advocate for the importance of health and wellbeing at work for our profession. And that's for obvious reasons like retention and for reducing sickness. But over the years, we've also argued that as a result of the emotional and the physical labour of the work that we do every single day as nurses and midwives, that it is an ethical imperative that we pay attention to this. And we can't expect people to care for others with complete commitment and dedication unless we are fully attending to their health and well-being to enable them to do that work. Now, the pandemic has shone a light on this issue, and the agenda around health and wellbeing has risen to the top of many organisations, regions, nations, top of their priority list, which is really great to see. And we were getting increasingly more requests for information around the evidence base. So what's the why? Why should we be doing this? What's the case for support? But also the how. What's some really great examples of how we can achieve this? And so that was where this particular book came from. We wanted to put together a really accessible blueprint for all of us that are motivated and committed to the agenda of health and wellbeing for nurses and midwives to take forward the best practice and have the evidence at their fingertips to do that. So today we're going to be hearing from people that have contributed to the book, a really multidisciplinary group of academics and clinicians talking about their different perspectives on the issues related to health and wellbeing. And I'm going to hand you over now to Holly, who's going to talk a little bit about the structure of the book, the way in which we've put this together, and really also to say a huge thank you to Holly for leading this project and being really the person that has coordinated and enabled such a coherent and cohesive piece of academic output to be created. So thank you, Holly, and over to you.
Many thanks, Gemma. So we're really excited today to introduce this book to you, which, as Gemma said, it's a collaboration between the University of Nottingham, the Florence Nightingale Foundation, but we've got contributors from across the UK and beyond. Could we have the next slide, please? So there's no doubt that fostering a healthy and happy workforce is good for everyone, and health and wellbeing in the nursing and midwifery workforce has long been a consideration, but it's not always been prioritised. And with concerns about the retention of early career and established healthcare professionals rising, we're seeing organisations across the UK increasingly committed to systematically addressing factors that influence and undermine health and wellbeing across all health and social care environments. So in this text, as Gemma said, we wanted it to be practical, we wanted it to be accessible, and it's guidance for nurses and midwives on managing their wellbeing at work. And we're really proud to have coordinated this with the input of so many people, 36 contributors with expertise in nursing, midwifery, workplace health and psychology. I'm a psychologist myself, a professor of behavioural medicine. It's so nice that we've got this interdisciplinary group of people. And we believe this book is going to be helpful to individuals looking to enrich their own wellbeing and experiences of work and the experiences of colleagues, team leaders who are committed to creating team cultures and working environments that foster well-being and help us look after our well-being, and of course senior leaders that have influence over policies and practices of organisations, and they have the potential to make sure that well-being is embedded into the fabric of the clinical environment. So the style of writing across the whole of this book is conversational, and that's so that it can make it very accessible to people at all different levels. And the chapters are purposely very short, quite focused, and they each end with 5 key recommendations and a practical activity. And that's to help readers transfer their learning into practice. And we've made use of case studies throughout, which we think is quite unique about this book, is we've embedded case studies that offer examples of strategies that we know have been successfully implemented to support and enhance the well-being of the workforce. There's so much good practice out there, and it's nice to be able to bring it together into this text. So I just want to run through the structure of the book before we move to the speakers. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So in section 1, the case for health and wellbeing at work, here we're outlining the cost of ill health to employers, and we provide the business case for organisations to invest in wellbeing by outlining the cost to employers of ill health in the workforce, and giving some perspectives on the way in which health and wellbeing can be impacted by the health and social care environment and the nature of the work that nurses and midwives engage in on a day-to-day basis. And in this section, we're looking at why health and wellbeing is a primary consideration for employers in terms of the impact of health and ill health on individuals, on the workforce and the organisation, and how it impacts on the quality of care that nurses and midwives can provide. So you can see the types of things here about the economic burden, the importance to organisations and patient care, how stress impacts us on us and leads to compassion fatigue, burnout, and the associations between those things. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So section 2, we've got managing emotions in difficult times. And here we're moving forward to explore the ways in which ongoing concerns that diminish well-being can progress into more significant challenges associated with mental health issues. And this is intended to highlight the early warning signs of when things are going a bit wrong with mental health and deteriorating, and trying to come up with strategies that destigmatise mental ill health and encourage an open dialogue and open conversations among nurses and midwives related to emotional well-being. I think that's really important, being able to start conversations about mental health. So it's about being a bit more aware of what factors on the job influence us, how to have conversations and raise that, and how to recognise mental ill health in colleagues, and then how specifically to deal with anxiety and low mood. Could I move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Then we have our next section focuses on wellbeing needs at different times. And this section is a discussion of the varying wellbeing needs that impact at different stages of our careers or because of different job-related or lifestyle factors. It's an acknowledgement of the transient and fluctuating variables that can impact on well-being, and it emphasises the importance of different wellbeing strategies that are purposefully targeted to meet the unique needs of a diverse workforce. So we're looking at things like shift work and sleep and fatigue, managing wellbeing during periods of fasting, looking specifically at the nursing and midwifery student population, and then also focusing in different career stages, for example, late career. Moving to the next slide, please. Here we have the biggest section, enhancing wellbeing at work, and here's where all the practical strategies come in. We've got them all the way through up to section 4, but we're focusing here particularly on the factors that enhance wellbeing in the workplace. So underpinning this is the creation of a psychologically safe working environment where nurses and midwives feel they're able to speak up without fear of retribution. They're encouraged to share challenges and raise concerns. And it's argued that this is the foundation for wellbeing interventions, strategies and innovations to be received by the workforce as a valued investment in them as a workforce. And this section includes a focus on strategies for self-care and healthy lifestyles. And it also concludes with the learning that's arisen from the psychological impact of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, of course, wellbeing is something that's been a focus for a very long time and should be moving forwards. But we have been through this unique 3-year period where we've responded to a crisis situation. So here we've got a whole ton of examples: creating psychologically safe work environments, clinical supervision, teamwork across occupational boundaries and multidisciplinary teams. We've got things like shared governance, Schwartz rounds, psychological first aid, and then we're looking at lifestyle factors like, protecting and self-care behaviours and lifestyle factors like physical activity, healthy eating, hydration, and then we end with the challenge of health and well-being in a crisis. And with some pointers about the future as well. So if I could just have the final slide, please. So just to summarise, through this book, we're really taking you on a journey, and we're starting with the business case for why organisations should invest in the health and well-being of the workforce and embed well-being into organisational policies and practice. And we're introducing key areas of health and well-being and providing strategies for actions that we can take to maximise physical and mental health and support the well-being of not only ourselves, but others around us. And we discuss health and well-being in the specific context of the nursing and midwifery role across the whole of the professional career, even through the most challenging of times, like the global public health crisis that we've just been and continue to go through. And at all times, we're asking the reader to think a lot more about the issues that are raised in the chapters by engaging with activities involving reflection and planning. And then through these case studies, we really want to inspire readers by showcasing the innovations that are implemented by individuals, teams and organisations, giving examples across the health and care sector. And we really hope that readers are going to use this information to make a difference where they work or study, because individual people are not passive recipients of health and wellbeing initiatives, but they play a key role in creating and sustaining environments where people feel supported and can flourish. So we really hope that this book will help nurses and midwives to advocate wellbeing where they work and improve the working environment for peers, patients and clients. So we're really privileged to have had Professor Jill Mabon contribute the foreword for this book, and we're absolutely delighted that she's joined us today. So I'm going to hand over now to Jill.
Thanks so much, Holly and Gemma, and thanks for that introduction. So good morning, everyone. My name is Professor Jill Mabon. I'm Professor of Health Services Research and Nursing. The clue there that I was a nurse, am a nurse, is in my title. So I've been studying nurse wellbeing for over 20 years. So it was a great privilege and honour to be asked to write this forward. And I'm really delighted to be here this morning to talk to you about some of my ideas that are in the forward, but why I welcome this book so much. So I think it's important, firstly, to say that nurses and midwives have some of the highest levels of occupational stress and resulting distress compared with other groups. So it's very timely and important that we focus attention on this. I think nurses and midwives work in an environment where the human needs of others are often an urgent priority, and we understand that. So therefore, it's easy for nurses and midwives to put their own needs second or sometimes last. The health and well-being of the nursing and midwifery workforce has been considered important, but not always an absolute essential priority. And if the COVID pandemic, as Gemma said, did one positive thing, it definitely shone a light on the critical significance of the psychological well-being of the healthcare workforce, particularly nurses and midwives working on the front line. The immense challenges and trauma that nurses experienced during their working lives was finally being recognised. And research I was privileged to be involved with, the impact of COVID on nurses study, where we interviewed nurses 4 times across the pandemic, a longitudinal study, highlighted the stress, trauma and distress experienced by nurses. And some of that is reported in chapter 22. So I encourage you to have a look at that. And we know how important this ongoing support is. We know the pandemic's not over. We know some nurses still have significant psychological trauma as a result of the pandemic. So it needs to be really continuous and supported for some time to come. And so this book is therefore timely and important. And I really want to make 4 key points this morning. I'm really pleased to be here and be able to have a platform for talking about some of my work, but some of the ideas that I think the book picks up really well. I think significantly, the book recognises that the responsibility for nurses and midwives' psychological health is a collective national and organisational responsibility. It's not just an individual one. So putting responsibility for good mental health on individuals and exhorting them to improve their resilience can neglect the wider structural and organisational constraints that negatively affect psychological well-being and lets organisations therefore off the hook sometimes. Remaining resilient, for example, in the face of staff shortages is an impossible expectation, yet staff need to keep going and manage work challenges. So I think that's really an important thing to say. And this book provides important information on the ways to manage emotions in difficult times and start conversations about mental health at work. And those conversations are really important. And that leads me to my second point. We know that stigma can be a barrier to speaking up about our psychological health. Holly's mentioned that. And the book identifies the importance of interprofessional support and psychological safety at work, showing how to create psychologically safe work environments and social support across occupational boundaries and within teams. So it provides tangible action to support the promotion of a culture of psychological safety, where well-being can be openly discussed and people can raise concerns. And that's a really important step in reducing stigma and recognising the impact of providing emotional support for people accessing health and care services, so our patients and clients and colleagues. We all support our colleagues too, in the face of the challenging work situations and trauma. And Holly kindly mentioned Schwartz rounds there. Some of you may know what these are and may have been to one. I led a national study evaluating Schwartz rounds, which are a reflective group space where people come together to talk about the emotional, psychological, the emotional, ethical, and societal challenges of working in healthcare. So it's often a space that is unique. Often people don't come together and talk about these things, difficult patients, difficult situations. How did I manage that? People share stories, and through that, the audience can then build second stories and can share and reflect together. So really important. And our research showed that built teamwork and also reduced stress. As measured by the GHQ-12, we showed that regular attendance improves psychological well-being at work. So important work there. So if you haven't been to a Schwartz round, look out for one. And if you have, you will know what I'm talking about. Thirdly, I think the authors of this book show that there is a link between staff psychological well-being at work and patient experiences and outcomes of care. Over a decade ago, my colleagues and I demonstrated that the experience of healthcare staff shapes people's experiences of care, whether good or bad. So we know that link exists, but I think sometimes we can easily forget that. And that's another reason for focusing on this. And finally, health and care professionals come to work to support people at some of the most difficult times of their lives, to support their colleagues and ultimately make a difference by providing high quality care. And to do this, they should be able to gain help with their psychological help, not as an add-on, but as an expected and central part of their work. And I think this book, I have my own copy here, helps us do this and sets out ways to do this and ways to support each other and our colleagues. So thank you for the opportunity to write the foreword, to talk about the book, and I commend the book to you. And thank you very much.
Thank you so, so much, Jill. We were absolutely honoured that you agreed to do the foreword. And I think for all of those key messages you shared with our audience today, you were absolutely the right person to demonstrate that this is not a second thought. This is absolutely central to our workforce. So thank you so, so much, Jill.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So we'll move on now to hear from some of our other authors that have contributed to the book. And what we would like to encourage you to do, you've already started by introducing yourself, which is absolutely wonderful to see the breadth of areas that people are coming from, different professional backgrounds and different countries as well. And we really want to start that dialogue with you here as our audience. So please do post in the chat any reflections you have on what you've heard so far today, and also any questions you would like to ask any of the authors that are presenting, myself and Holly as well. I should also mention that we have a 20% discount for everybody that has attended the webinar today. And my colleague at FNF, Adam, is going to pop a code. So if you don't already have the book and you were interested based on what you've heard today, there's that opportunity to purchase it with that discount. So we'll move on to our first author now. And as Holly said, our book is separated into different sections. And section 1 was really about setting out the case for support. So why health and wellbeing is so important for nurses and midwives within their work. So I'm really pleased to introduce you to Kevin Teo. And Kevin is a senior lecturer in organisational psychology at the University of London. And Kevin wrote his chapter focused on why healthcare employers should promote health and the cost of ill health at work. So I'd like to introduce Kevin to pop on his camera now and speak to you a bit more about his chapter. Oh, it does look like Kevin might have lost connection. So that's fine because we have 11 other presenters that are ready and raring to go. So let me move on then to our next author, which is Jo Daniels. So really warm welcome to Jo Daniels. And Jo is a clinical psychologist at North Bristol NHS Trust and also a senior lecturer at the University of Bath. And Jo contributed to the second section of our book, which was dealing with anxiety and low mood. And the whole of that section really looks at how we manage our emotions in difficult times. So over to you, Jo. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you to both the editors for inviting myself and also Rachel Pascal, who wrote the chapter with me to contribute to what feels like a really important book at this time. So just a quick introduction for myself then. So as already outlined, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I work in clinical practice. I work with anxiety and depression all of the time, and my research background as well is in anxiety, but also since the pandemic, like many people, I've been drawn towards working with the workforce and healthcare workers in particular. And my colleague Rachel is an academic colleague of mine, and she also works clinically in an ICU setting. In fact, at the back of the chapter, you'll see that our case study is based in a hospital that she works in, so Royal United Hospital. So what can I tell you about the chapter? I guess there's a few key messages in our chapter. Firstly, I think it's really important that while during the pandemic we all started to think about mental health, and it was so much easier to check in about mental health, and that's certainly one of the COVID keeps, that anxiety and low mood was in common parlance. We all talked about it. I did a lot of research on anxiety over the pandemic and how that affected our mental health. So we've got that language now to talk about it, which I think is really important, but we still need a deeper understanding of how it affects us, particularly in the workplace. So part of the main message of the chapter was to gain a deeper understanding, firstly, of how anxiety is a sort of normal response and low mood is a normal response, but really how that persists. So how do we make that transition from having a bad day and feeling quite anxious to feeling anxious a lot of the time? So we talk about normal psychology. So I'd like to say a little bit about that. So anxiety particularly is a very normal evolutionary response to experiencing threat and having a very difficult time. So that threat can be social, it can be emotional, it can be physical, but it can be also brought up at work very frequently, especially when we're working in really stressful environments that can trigger off what is an evolutionary response to keep us safe. So that anxiety, that physiology, and that's something we don't talk about enough, I think, that physiology that we feel in our bodies and that our brains are actually trying to get us to look after ourselves and to be safe. But mental health is a dynamic process. None of us are unaffected by mental health challenges, and it takes some maintenance. We need to look after ourselves because we all experience anxiety, we all experience low mood, we all experience some stress at some time, but it's about how we respond to that stress. So in the chapter, Rachel talks very eloquently about this concept of the window of tolerance. So it's an idea around the fact that we can all manage so much, depending on what we've got going in our lives at that time, depending on the resources we have, but also the trouble that we're facing at that time. So it's an idea of how we can function effectively within certain parameters, within a window of tolerance. And that might change from day to day, but it also might change from moment to moment, what we can manage, depending what challenges we've had. So introducing that concept that actually we've all got limits and that we all must observe that and really stick within those limits. So moving on to depression, we talked about anxiety, and I just sort of outlined that there, and we talk about that maintenance cycle, the idea of what keeps it going. We do talk about anxiety and depression from a cognitive behavioural framework. So for those of you who are not familiar with that, it's the idea that thoughts, feelings and behaviours all interlink to produce our experience, and particularly our mental health experience. So with depression, how can we characterise that? So the idea with depression is that you see the world very negatively, you see yourself very negatively, and you see the future very negatively as well. And seeing that triad of symptoms in depression is actually quite key in identifying the early warning signs. Excuse me, at the end of a cold. So we talk about the low mood as well, and how that also maintains itself. So you might be familiar with terms like negative thoughts and negative thinking, and how easy it is to get into negative spirals. So we create a list of common negative thinking errors, and you can have a look in the book. I've got it right here on one of the pages. Actually, we provide a list of some of the common negative thinking errors. And if you've got the book, I'd really recommend that you have a look, because it's something that we all do, whether it's catastrophizing or black and white thinking. It's very normal, but in difficult times, actually, that can really amplify your anxiety and depression. So we go on to talk about identifying early warning signs. At the back of the chapter, there's an activity where you can think about, how can I intervene early? If I'm having a difficult day at work, how can I notice I'm starting to move towards the edges of that window of tolerance? So I'd really point you towards the activities at the book. But we also give some tips on how to manage your mental health. And I've always said throughout the pandemic and throughout the work that I've done, is that it's basics first. Make sure that you've eaten, you've had something to drink, you've had enough rest, and breathing. Breathing is really, really important. So if you can slow yourself down, as simple as it sounds, it actually gives your brain the message that there isn't a threat, that everything is okay. And when you get down to that sort of slow breathing, and you're able to think more clearly, because when we're anxious, it narrows our thinking. So we provide some recommendations on what you can do. And of course, if you have anxiety and depression, where it's impacting your life and your functioning on a day-to-day level, I would say you need to go further than this chapter to ask for some help. But we provide some top tips really on how to manage these emotional discomfort, distress at work. But also to bear in mind, something that Jill said earlier, is that we've already dealt with a huge amount. So think back on how you've already dealt with some similar experiences, the resilience that you've got, the experiences that you've got, that actually we've dealt with a lot, and there are ways that we can really work with each other, connect with each other to support ourselves and one another at work. Thanks, Holly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jo. That was really excellent. A really in-depth overview of the content of the chapter and the really key aspects of that, but also how there's some elements that are very practical, things that we can all apply to ourselves, not just those of us that perhaps identify as experience more significant mental health problems, but actually all of us have those moments of low mood and worry. And that's a really important message. Thank you so much, Jo, and look forward to some questions for you at the end.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on now to our next contributor. And this is where we move on to the third section of our book, which looks at our wellbeing needs at different times. And that's different times throughout our career, but also different times in terms of the other factors that are influencing our wellbeing as part of our clinical practices as nurses and midwives. So I'm going to introduce you first of all to Rohit Sagu. And Rohit is a registered nurse and also a PhD student at the University of Bedfordshire. And Rohit's chapter specifically focuses on wellbeing needs during periods of fasting. So when you're ready, Rohit, please do pop your camera on and take us through your chapter.
Hi everyone, and thank you for participating in this morning's webinar in terms of the book launch as well. So my name's, as Gemma said, my name is Rohit Sagu. I'm a PhD student and just at University of Bedfordshire children's nurse as well, but I also am founder and director of British Sikh Nurses. So that's an organisation that supports South Asian nurses in practice as well. And that's really what stemmed me around this chapter in terms of what I'm doing. So it's looking about wellbeing needs during fasting. And I'm going to say, that fasting, when we mean fasting, it's not fasting for patients. It's our well-being in terms of our fasting as well, and recognizing, the times that we actually inadvertently as nurses do intermittent fasting by not eating very much during the ward shift and etc. But also recognizing our colleagues of different religious backgrounds in terms of when they're adopting fasting for certain religious periods as well. So this chapter really looks at the practice around fasting for nursing and midwives and how it affects their well-being as well. And we look at, in terms of it, it's got I've got a case study in there in terms of looking at a person of a Hindu religion that has, is busy in a department, but fasting during periodic days during the week as well, that we need to recognize as leaders in nursing as well. It also looks at different outlines, different fasting periods that's exercised by different religions, from the Islamic holy month of Ramadan to Judaism, from Yom Kippur, Buddhists and Hinduism fasting as well, for practicing on different days where the moon is out as well, and during festivals as well, and also Roman Catholics during Lent as well. So that's really important that we really recognize our broad, inclusive workforce and the times and periods that they're actually fasting as well. The chapter also gives examples of religious fasting whilst nurses are on wards as well, and midwives are on wards, and also a support from the Royal College of Nursing in terms of their assessment tools and what they use around it as well. And when I wrote this as well, there's a plethora of research around patient fasting, but there is very little in terms of how the fasting that we do as professionals and nurses as well. And as we move into a very diverse workforce, especially with having international nurses come into our workforce as well. So, as an example, the many thousands of Indian nurses that are coming from India, we really need to recognize the days that they're fasting, and also for managers and colleagues alike to turn around and say, okay, in terms of days they're fasting, is it, there's also a notion of, like, if you've got someone from an Islamic religion that might be fasting during Ramadan, do we eat in front of them? Those kind of questions as well. So there's all sorts of well-being issues that we have in terms of that, and thinking about, having a box of chocolates on the ward while somebody's fasting. So, we always tend to think, are we eating? What do we need to do as managers, or do we need to do as colleagues to support our fellow colleagues who are fasting as well? So it's really about looking at how we apply fasting and well-being's needs during fasting as well. And this plays a major role in terms of how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about our colleagues, and how our colleagues feel about their day in terms of how they're fasting through the day as well. So it could be that they're in stressful, the volume of stress and anxiety, which Jo's picked up on previously in her talk just now. Obviously fasting can the amount of stress or anxiety or low mood or even depression as well. And slow your pace down in terms of working. So thinking about, if you're working in a busy environment like AED, there won't be times where colleagues who are fasting might be feeling fatigue at some point as well during the day, especially for those who are doing Ramadan for a whole month. It becomes very difficult. The very first 2 weeks become very difficult for a lot of members of staff as well, for a lot of Muslim members of staff as well. So it's really recognizing when they have fatigue and when they need to have a break as well. And when they go without water for such a long time as well, for a long period as well. So it's recognizing those needs as well, and including short breaks, rest breaks for them as well, and short windows of breaks as well. So it's really looking at how we manage that as well. We also look at intermittent fasting. So the chapter looks at intermittent fasting, how we nurses inadvertently sometimes do intermittent fasting by not eating for quite some time as well. And also, how that might contribute to lowering our cholesterol levels and etc. as well. And it's quite an interesting way of looking at it as well, and how we eat certain particular foods at certain times as well. So there's a case study in terms of that as well. But what I want to kind of leave you with is just some of the key points in terms of what we've really discussed within this chapter is the benefits to intermittent fasting for nurses and midwives as well. So there are some benefits as well fasting from a religious and cultural perspective, and the emotion that it carries for nurses and midwives, and recognizing that emotion as well. Controlling a diet during intermittent fasting as well. Some of us may be doing intermittent fasting, so there's lots of apps around that we turn around and want to get involved with, you know, on our phones to turn around and say how many times and we've heard so many, you know, lots of stuff around social media, how beneficial intermittent fasting is and how using app is. So it's really recognizing that as well. For us who are non-religious, that are just fasting anyway, for that period as well. So that's recognizing that as well. So there's many ways of health promoting in terms of health fasting as well. And it's important to recognize that you choose the right one and the one that you're comfortable with. And also, just over the years, as a British leader of British Sikh nurses, obviously I've observed many South Asian religions, from South Asian people, you know, fasting as well. So it's really looking at how we focus that support around that group of people, and actually all groups of people who are fasting in terms of that area as well. So that's kind of leads into my end of my chapter. So hopefully that will, you know, evoke some thought in terms of your practice and looking out for everyone else's well-being who may be just going through a period of fasting. Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Rohit. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't know about everybody else, but certainly when I read Rohit's contribution to the book and really thinking about how I have made some assumptions, probably not recognised the implications of fasting for people from various different religious backgrounds. But also, as you said now, Rohit, this is becoming a trend, isn't it? And so something that's applicable to many people. So I really, really value that input. Thank you so much, and really getting us thinking about some of the nuances of health and well-being that I don't believe, as you said, from doing your own research, has been covered in other areas. So thank you again. And again, any questions you have for Rohit, he will be here at the end of the session to answer. Okay, we'll move now on to the next chapter in our section 3 around wellbeing needs at different times. And this is a chapter that has been written by Liz Chamlambus. And this is a chapter that focuses around the implications of shift work and how this influences our sleep patterns and managing fatigue. Liz is a registered nurse also, but also is assistant professor at the University of Nottingham. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to everyone. Hello, my name is Dr. Liz Chamlambus. I'm an assistant professor and adult nurse. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about my contribution to this really important book, which is Shift Work, Sleep and Managing Fatigue. I think it's really relevant and important for nurses and midwives because of the 24/7 cover that we often provide in different jobs. And when writing this chapter, I didn't just draw from evidence, but I also used my own personal experience of working night shifts and staying up all day to care for my preschool age children. And I realised that this is not ideal, and this actually had a negative impact on my health. I felt constantly jet lagged and put on loads of weight as I was eating for energy to compensate for a lack of sleep. So when I was asked to write this chapter, I saw it not only as an opportunity to outline the issues of shift work, sleep and fatigue, but also the opportunity to suggest some practical solutions. So the chapter outlines what is meant by shift work, who works shifts and the importance of sleep. And it goes on to suggest recommendations at national, local and personal level. So people generally need around 8 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period because this supports our immunity, gives us protection against diseases such as heart disease. And insufficient sleep can impact health in other ways too, as shift workers are more likely to smoke, eat less fruit and vegetables, although they are found to drink less alcohol than non-shift workers. But there are also social issues to consider, such as the impact of family life, as shift work can result in disrupted family meal times and limited time spent with children. And the needs of shift workers can vary at different times in their life, such as when they're breastfeeding or undergoing the menopause. So my chapter focuses on what can be done to support shift workers, and from a national perspective, While recognising the challenges involved in supporting shift workers, the chapter includes suggestions to government as to how they can address socio-economic inequalities through well thought out social policy to address gender imbalances in the workplace. And this includes suggestions around taxation, early years support and widening access to healthcare services. So from an employer perspective, suggestions include changes to the organisational infrastructure, such as offering flexible contracts or term time contracts and providing access to healthy food and drinking water out of hours, areas to promote sleep and rest breaks, and storage facilities for people who are lactating to store their breast milk. And then from an individual perspective, shift workers can support themselves by aiming for a healthy weight, eating a healthy diet, drinking sufficient fluids to keep hydrated. They can also take advantage of the health screening services that they're offered and managing their own sleep routines. So in conclusion, at the end of this chapter, there is an activity to encourage reflection on how shift work makes you feel and the challenges that shift workers might face when striving to stay healthy, because I'm sure we're all aware it's not that easy, really. There's also a case study from Newcastle Hospital's NHS Trust, which takes a whole team approach to managing fatigue in maternity services. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to say thank you all so much for attending. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy reading my chapter on shift work, sleep and managing fatigue. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Liz. And what struck me about your chapter, Liz, is that this is something that we accept as part of the nature of the practice that many of us as nurses and midwives engage in. And we probably don't give it enough consideration in terms of the implications of that for our health and well-being. And that's on an organisational perspective, as you said, but also on an individual perspective. So really great to highlight those things and think about the ways in which we can address them. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. So moving on to our next chapter within this particular section, and that's really about health and well-being throughout the lifespan of our career. There is a chapter in the book that focuses on students and early careers, and a really amazing case study that was contributed by Anne Felton around how mental health needs of students can be supported through peer support. But also thinking, which we are more likely to neglect actually, how we consider the health and well-being needs of those colleagues that are reaching more of towards the end of their career. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce you to Sue Haynes. And Sue is, again, a registered nurse, but also Assistant Director of Nursing at Nottingham University Hospitals. And Sue has done a huge amount of work to really advocate and support nurses who are reaching towards the end of their careers, and has shared her learning through this chapter on wellbeing and later career in nursing and midwifery.
Thank you, Gemma. Hope you can hear okay. Yes, so thank you for the opportunity. It's been a real privilege to contribute, excuse me, to this important book. As Gemma outlines, my chapter is focusing very much on well-being at late career for nursing midwifery. Practically defined here for probably nurses 55 over or early 50s, but some of the contents very applicable to nurses of all ages, much wider age groups. But the concept, I think, is important to consider that the wellbeing and retention of late career nurses and midwives is one of the most critical workforce issues facing health and social care currently around the world, because we know there are not enough younger nurses coming into the profession and that we have global shortages. But I ask you to consider in this chapter that this does require a significant shift in thinking for both us all as nurses and midwives, our own personal and professional expectations throughout our career, and also managers and employers who are leading organisations and cultures. So I do include some practical advice to support individual nurses and midwives, and really also want to discuss the importance of raising awareness about the value and importance of professional expertise and knowledge and skills in practice. So we know that research much research actually has shown that nursing has been long undervalued as a profession. And often some of my research findings identified that nurses don't necessarily fully appreciate the skills, knowledge and expertise they have gained through years of working across different settings and roles. Nursing is fantastic in that it offers so many diverse pathways and roles, as does midwifery, in different contexts and different settings. And sometimes we do not consider the transferability of those opportunities as we progress towards different stages of our career pathway. And we know that nursing and midwifery are fast-paced careers developing now due to so many different innovations. However, particularly at late career, I would like to hope through this chapter to challenge that we don't necessarily think about alternative opportunities and careers, the transferability of skills and expertise that we have as nurses and midwives, and may often stay focused within the own setting that we're working in or the organisation. So how do we also make sure employers are really ensuring inclusive cultures where the diversity of nurses, midwives from, as we've heard already, a wide background of cultures, countries now, multinational, international workforces that we have. How are we really developing inclusive cultures where all nurses and midwives want to stay and work later into their careers, rather than leaving due to exhaustion or for sense that they're not able to progress? So the chapter does make recommendations for employers and organisations and consider some of the actions that we need to take. But more importantly, personally, for individuals at late career or earlier, in fact, the importance of financial advice, financial well-being to reduce stress and pressures, particularly around understanding your pension or your opportunities when you are approaching late career, not leaving it too late and suddenly understanding what your pension implications are. So some practical tips on that. And then the other thing, particularly around menopause symptoms in the workplace, only very more recently really recognised as an occupational condition and one that requires modifications in practice and reasonable adjustments. And considering how menopause kind of affects such a vast majority of nursing midwifery workforce, again, the chapter poses some suggestions about how we need to be more proactive in managing that for well-being. The other case study that's included is around the legacy mentor concept, which is obviously a comparatively new within this country. And I would like to thank our colleagues within my integrated care system who were so in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, who were so proactive in supporting the research we did a few years ago in testing out this concept and this model. And particularly to Bex Jones and Ali Pearce-Smith, the leadership fellows within our integrated care system, who have led so much work around understanding late career professionals' needs and priorities. So the chapter, I recommend nurses undertake a more proactive self-assessment of their life through a life wheel exercise and look at their hopes and expectations and their work-life balance at late career. Perhaps recognising more the transferability of some of the professional skills and knowledge, and ask what do you want from your career. Seeking careers advice, because often it's only in early career that nurses would consider, or midwives would consider, getting actually careers advice for themselves. Managers' conversations at late career may lend themselves more towards what the retirement options are, rather than, and what opportunities there are in that department, rather than thinking much broader and the retention of the expertise and knowledge and skills that an experienced late career nurse or midwife offers. So thinking about careers conversations, thinking about differently about what opportunities late career offer to help well-being and retention of nurses and midwives. It's recognised not only in nursing and midwifery and health and social care now, but much wider across different sectors of employment and industry. And actually, we need this. What I hope for this chapter is to share some of those ideas and to really help people from an individual or personal level, but also up for managers and at organisation level to consider valuing and caring for that experienced workforce as a critical workforce priority to help retain and develop and consider new opportunities in order that we can retain that knowledge and expertise for our benefits of our patients and clients and residents that we look after. And so I hope you enjoy the chapter. It's a privilege to be part of the book, and thank you, Gemma.
Oh, thank you, Sue. It's absolutely our privilege to have your contribution, and hopefully you can hear from Sue's account there of really the passion that she personally has for this area of support for the workforce, and so incredibly important. And particularly Sue and I have had some conversations recently about the potential that some of the digital transformation in practice might have for, again, really maximising the strengths and expertise of our late career nurses and midwives, but perhaps reducing some of that physical burden of the role. So really exciting stuff on the horizon. I know that Sue and Nottingham will be right at the heart and the forefront of it. Thank you so much, Sue. So you will have seen Louise Bramley pop up on our screen now, and we're moving on to the next section of our book. And this is really to look at some interventions that have been put in place or approaches within workforce and within organisational operations and culture that have the opportunity to enhance well-being, and probably slightly unusual in terms of what you would expect to see in a book that focuses on health and well-being. But we absolutely see that there is a real value in the way in which our governance structures and our decision making is organised and supported within an organisation, and how that then influences the health and well-being of the workforce. So Louise Bramley and Aqualine Chiving are both experts in this particular area. Louise is, again, registered nurse, but also head of nursing and midwifery research at Nottingham University Hospitals. Aqualine, also a registered nurse and assistant director of nursing at NUH as well. So over to you both.
Absolutely wonderful to be here alongside my lovely colleague Aqualine. Aqualine and I work very closely together, as do Aqualine, Sue and I, and Sue you heard from just a few moments ago. So just talking a little bit through our chapter around enhancing health and well-being through shared governance. I'll talk a little bit about the chapter itself, and then Aqualine's going to talk a little bit about the case study that we were very privileged to work with one of our colleagues on, who really was able to bring alive how her own experience through shared governance had really contributed to her health and well-being. So I think just a kind of brief introduction, really. The chapter starts off by really talking about how frustrations are at work when you don't feel you have the ability to contribute to the decisions that are being made. And many of us are very familiar working in environments where we feel like all of the decisions and the important decisions at work are made by much more senior colleagues, and you have very little influence over that. And we do know from some of the stuff that we've heard both this morning and both some of the literature that's out there, that when people have the ability to contribute, they feel autonomous. They feel like they've got a process at work through which they can have themselves heard. That it does contribute to people feeling more psychologically safe, as well as enhancing their health and well-being. And I think over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, we're really going to see some emerging evidence. I know there's research going on. There's a small amount of evidence at the moment about how this kind of leadership can really impact on people, and how they can identify their own kind of health and well-being through the way they're able to contribute to the wider picture of the NHS and the organisation within which they work. So the chapter talks a little bit about what shared governance is. It really talks through the kind of 4 elements of shared governance, which are around accountability, equity, partnership and ownership. And that's that kind of partnership element of shared governance that can really help people to feel as though they've got a contribution to make to work, and as a result of that, and alongside many of the other initiatives that we've heard about today, in collaboration can start for people to feel better about the environment within which they work. So talking a lot about engaging, empowering and unifying nurses and really closing that gap between the frontline and those kind of executive level nurses within an organisation across health and social care. And what we also know is that our Chief Nursing Officer in the UK has also really started to talk about distributed leadership. So really starting to understand what it's like for those that are on the front line, as well as those that are working in roles around nursing in health and social care that can contribute to some of the wider strategic aims of the organisations within which they sit. So shared governance is a form of distributed leadership. We've been doing it here at NUH for the last 10 years and have really started to see how evidence is emerging around that. And what we know really about shared governance is that it can take a few different forms. So often nurses, midwives become part of councils. It can be inclusive of the multidisciplinary team. So although it focuses on amplifying the voices of nurses and midwives within an organisation, it doesn't discount that. It just adds that to the multidisciplinary team and really enables people to think about how they can make the positive changes within practice that are going to make their working lives more satisfying and make them feel as though they're really contributing to patient outcomes as well as staff satisfaction within which they work. And we know from the literature and from some of the research that's been conducted around shared governance as a mechanism for distributed leadership that it can build autonomy, it can enable contribution, and it can enable people to feel a bigger sense of belonging within which they work. So the chapter goes on to talk a little bit about how you do make it work. And interestingly, I think we started shared governance at NUH, and it was driven by a very relatively junior nurse when you consider the kind of hierarchies that we have in nursing. So for many of you, this chapter is a real start of a conversation, perhaps, and taking this chapter to senior leaders within an organisation may well be something that we can empower you to do to really start to think about how you start to contribute to some of the decisions that are being made. So models of implementation and really starting to think about how all nurses and midwives across every stage of their career, including students, it's inclusive of our student nurses and midwives and how they can become involved and gain the experience alongside that. I'm going to pass you over to Aqualine now, who'll talk a little bit about the case study that we have in the book. Thanks, Aqualine.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. Thank you very much, Gemma, for inviting us to write a chapter in this book. When we got the invite, we were really excited because we really wanted to share with you what shared governance is done in our organization. Like Louise said, we started shared governance in 2012, and 10 years on, we are the organization with the most mature shared governance. And we wanted to share how empowering staff and giving them the voice and permission to innovate has really helped in the staff well-being. So one of the case studies which I've shared with you in the book is just one of many examples which our staff have told us what it made them feel by giving them the opportunity to take part in shared governance, which is actually regarding the 4 principles: ownership, equity, accountability, and partnership. People have found that it has made them want to stay in organizations, and it has improved how we do the projects, and especially with the well-being. And during COVID, we actually saw a real change in how staff looked after each other. Ward managers have been coming with testimonies to say if they didn't have the shared governance council, they wouldn't know how they would have managed, because shared governance councils, when people are empowered, they can just crack on and help each other and look after each other. And in our organization as well, we negotiated, say if people are off sick, they still are allowed to come and join the shared governance council, because we found that it was that sense of belonging which people knew they have to go back and work with their teams at work. And it also helped with the staff well-being by understanding each other's teams, because shared governance allows people to network and then know other people's areas where in normal cases they will never know about. And it also helped when we're in crisis, in clinical crisis moments where people have been distributed or redeployed to different areas, but because through shared governance, people have known what happens in other people's areas, so that fear has been minimized. So hopefully the book talks about the one example of one nurse who was really thinking of leaving the trust and was fed up and thought there was nowhere to go. When she joined shared governance, her life changed, And I can just say in brief, she started off as an educator and now she's moving on to a matron doing the PNA role and different things. We have kept that staff in the organization, and there are also other things which are coming from other staff members whom we've managed to keep in the organization. So please read our chapter if you are thinking of starting shared governing councils in your organizations. And like what Louise said, it is nice to start with the chief nurses, because the support they give you to start the shared governing councils, they will never regret it because of the outputs, what happens with the shared governing councils. And also it encourages the type of different membership on shared governing councils. When we started off, like Louise alluded, we started off with nursing and nurses and midwives only, but now we've introduced another chapter, another role within shared governance called an associate member, which is mainly aiming at our learners. We have got different learners in organizations, and encouraging them to be on shared governance councils helps with retention and want to come to work in your organizations. So please just read our chapter, and if you need more information, we are here in Nottingham to help. So thank you very much, Gemma.
Oh, thank you, Aqualine and Louise. And I really think that chapter particularly emphasises the point that was made earlier on by Jill around how health and wellbeing has to be around organisational culture and structures that enable and support empowerment and control, and how that can have such a positive impact on wellbeing. And the case study you shared there, Aqualine, is a brilliant example of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, our next chapter author that we'll hear from is Jess Sainsbury, and Jess again is a registered nurse and head of engagement, chair of the clinical supervision subject expert group with us in Team F&F. And Jess is going to be talking to you about the opportunity of clinical supervision to promote wellbeing. There are several chapters in the book that talk about the value of different forums that enable reflective practice. Schwartz rounds is another one, but Jess is particularly focusing around clinical supervision. Jess, we have loads of professional nurse advocates in the audience, so I think we're talking to the converted. But over to you to share some of the thinking and the evidence that you've gathered in your chapter.
Amazing. Thanks, Gemma. So pleased to hear that there are many PNAs here. Thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Jess, and I was one of the two authors for the clinical supervision and wellbeing chapter, alongside the absolute legend, I'm sure he won't mind me saying that is Tony Butterworth. Firstly, I'm super pleased that Gemma and Holly asked us to write this chapter on clinical supervision for those at any stage of their career. So not just students, not those who are established, absolutely everyone. In this chapter, we start with a bit of storytelling on the journey of clinical supervision from a research and evidence perspective. There's a lot out there, and we will continue adding more, but we kind of walk you through that in the first part of the chapter. We know that clinical supervision is valuable and helpful in developing professional practice, but also on our wellbeing as nurses and midwives as well, but also acknowledging the impact it has on our professional identity of nurses and midwives. Of course, we showcase the Florence Nightingale Foundation Clinical Supervision Subject Expert Group and the 7 working principles that the Subject Expert Group agreed on for how nurses and midwives can engage meaningfully with clinical supervision. Spoiler alert, it should start with students in pre-reg education, and it should be used as a supportive and sympathetic intervention, not a disciplinary measure. We then delve into more detail around clinical supervision in the curriculum and the roles of all of us, not just university staff, but actually those of us who are in practice or anyone that's in contact with student and early career nurses, in making this part of that next generation's everyday practice and the impact that it can have on their wellbeing and keeping them in the profession. The transition from student to newly registered nurse or midwife is well known as a challenging time, and one where they require strong support through preceptorship programmes, orientation to their role, to their workplace, and being a registered professional. We discuss in the chapter how clinical supervision is key during this period to, again, retaining these new professionals. Next, we explore clinical supervision and the established nurse or midwife. And during this section of the chapter, we discuss mature learners, their experiences and motivation to engage in this element of professional development and professional identity. And I'm really pleased that we were able to, toward the end, bring the student voice into this chapter through the case study with the help of our friends at the Foundation of Nursing Studies and fellow case study author Grace Cook. Here in the case study, student nurse at the time, Treasure, reflects on the resilience-based clinical supervision programme that she undertook with the Foundation of Nursing Studies during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it had on her practice during that challenging time and how she's taking it through her career now. One of her reflections that I wanted to share with you today was that she felt disappointed that she had reached the latter part of her pre-reg programme and not received clinical supervision. But the positive spin on that is that she has pledged that she would ensure that any students or anyone generally in the future that she came across in practice would know about clinical supervision, and she'd be able to help with that too. So well done, Treasure. And last but not least, our activity for the chapter encourages the reader to consider the different models for clinical supervision, because we know that not one size works, or not one model works for all. And we encourage the reader to find themselves a clinical supervisor and take this into their own hands and not wait for it to happen for them. So we hope that you find this chapter and of course the whole book helpful. And please do connect with us at F&F if you would like to learn more about our work on clinical supervision, the subject expert group or the Learning Network. Back to you, Gemma.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jess. And I think really emphasising there that clinical supervision is not something that we need to put at the bottom of our priority list, that it has to be integral and accessible to all nurses and midwives. And what we know from the research is that those often that need it the most, working in the high intensive inpatient environments, it's those nurses and midwives that struggle to get the time released. And that's been a lot of the work we've been doing at the foundation, is really enabling to make a case for support to enable that to happen. Thank you. That's brilliant. Take care, Jess. So now moving on to our final author from section 4, and that's Stefan. Thank you for popping up there, Stefan. Stefan Schilling is a research fellow at Oxford Brookes University and has led a whole programme of research which is so fascinating into how teamwork can enable social support across occupational boundaries, looking at various different circumstances and contexts and really understanding the mechanism of how that happens organically, but also how organisations can facilitate and enable that to happen. So Stefan, over to you.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot for having us write this chapter. It was a great privilege to be contributing to this book. There's a slight correction. I'm not at Oxford Brookes anymore, on the University of Oxford now, at the Pandemic Sciences Institute. So my research is basically on how group membership and social identity impacts upon teamwork and mental health, especially during emergencies and pandemics. And Maria and myself, and I hope Maria is in the audience, we're trying to address in our chapter how to develop teamwork and social support across occupational boundaries. But before I go into the details of the chapter, I want to ask you a few questions. Have you ever walked out of a patient's room during rounds, afraid to tell the know-it-all doctor what you thought the patient needed? Or how many times were you frustrated because a therapist didn't understand something that you know to be basic knowledge? Thoughts like these are very common when we're working in interprofessional, multidisciplinary teams where personnel from different professional backgrounds are asked to work together. And unfortunately, such thoughts often result in at worst interpersonal conflict and at best a pulling up of drawbridges along occupational lines, but that often leads to a breakdown of communication and teamwork. So our chapter is essentially trying to address where some of these issues come from and what can be done to develop effective teamwork and necessarily social support despite the problems in such teams. Since the start of the millennium, there's been an increase of research on interprofessional teams, and the benefit of such teams, it has been widely researched. Very consistently, it has been linked to positive patient outcomes such as decreasing readmissions, mortality rates, clinical errors, or adverse drug events, and it's even increasing patient satisfaction. And as team members from diverse backgrounds can often bring different expertise, ideas and skills to the table. It has been associated with better team performance and even with higher levels of staff well-being and an atmosphere of social support, which has repeatedly been linked to job satisfaction, a reduction of conflict, and recovery from traumatic experiences. However, these benefits often depend on functioning teams and an identification with the team. And as the really, really insightful case study at the end of the chapter by Ian Joy, Chief Nurse at Newcastle NHS Trust, shows, such teams take a substantial time to develop the shared team identity, the team communication and patient documentation and processes necessary for such successful teamwork. Especially during COVID, such issues could arise when personnel from other areas were deployed to work there. So some of you might be familiar with that. For example, our recent study suggests that teamwork, team bonding, and social support could alleviate the impact of adverse COVID experiences on mental health. But unfortunately, this effect did not occur in those deployed to COVID wards, which had no prior intensive care experience, and thus they did not feel part of the team. So why are some people benefiting from teamwork and others don't? The chapter describes a couple of potential reasons. Obviously, different experiences or professional skills have an impact on conflict, as team members from different backgrounds have different training, different knowledge base, or have learned different communication or documentation procedures. Similarly, personnel and stress responses have an impact, and sections 2 and 3 of the book are really insightful on how difficult situations can cause us to react short-tempered, which can increase conflict. However, oftentimes conflict results from seeing colleagues through the lens of social group memberships, and in particular, the stereotypes used to differentiate other occupational groups are important here. Stereotypes can be useful as a very quick mental shortcut to assess whether someone has a particular skill set, but unfortunately, during conflict, we often then retreat into our hierarchies and group memberships, and we end up being very quick to call ICU nurses strong-headed, aggressive control freaks, or surgeons tyrannical megalomaniacs. I'm quoting here. But even benign or perhaps at first glance complementary stereotypes about roles can have a negative impact on teamwork, workload, or even mental health. For example, while we may think that the comment nurses and midwives are communal, socially competent, and caring is a much better characterization than the ones I just mentioned, the real-world implications of being perceived as social and caring can be quite negative. Because of these characterizations, many of the emotional and psychosocial aspects of patient care, such as holding the iPad so a dying patient during COVID can say goodbye to their family, were left to nurses. And we found that such duties, in particular, due to their emotional weight, were linked at a higher rate to burnout and post-traumatic stress than any other tasks during COVID. In fact, research has repeatedly shown that misperceptions of roles and responsibilities based on perceived stereotypes about someone's occupation are some of the main reasons for conflict and negative patient outcomes in interprofessional teams. So, what can we do to build teamwork, a common team identity, and social support in interprofessional teams? The chapter discusses some practical suggestions from the research that can be used to increase commonality across teams, reduce ostracization based on group membership, and get everyone on the same song sheet. It also highlights the crucial role leaders play in assigning roles, managing work expectations and resources, and setting the tone for how team members treat each other, and what in particular leaders can do themselves to make their team more inclusive, such as practicing shared leadership, which Louise and Aquilin have written about in their chapter. The chapter also provides some suggestions for what organizations can do to facilitate teamwork through communication changes and departmental layouts. And lastly, the chapter discusses some suggestions for what can be done to build and preserve a supportive work climate that aids in coping with job stressors and traumatic situations and allows colleagues from all kinds of backgrounds to feel they can ask for support, but also they feel comfortable giving it. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stefan. And hopefully our audience got a sense there of the in-depth analysis and the evidence base that you've been gathering really up to the minute, very current and very relevant to the context of the workforce that we're working with during and in this what's been known as a post-pandemic phase, although I know people don't necessarily feel that that's the case. Thank you, Stefan, and also the challenge of translating all of that academic research into that accessible format that you've shared with us today. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to take us back now to section 1 because we've been joined by Kevin Teo. And as I mentioned before, our book focuses very much on the how, but also the why. And Kevin really sets the scene for the book as the very first chapter, looking at the case for health and wellbeing at work and why this is important to employers and really understanding the cost. Kevin is a senior lecturer in organisational psychology at the University of London, and we're really pleased to welcome you, Kevin, to today, and thank you again for your contribution.
Thank you for the introduction, Gemma, and also to Holly for the opportunity, both of you, to work on this book. And it's been wonderful to hear from all the excellent contributions this morning. So as Gemma said, this chapter was focusing on the why. So why actually is it important for us to look at the health and well-being of nurses and midwives? As a psychologist, I've always been interested as to why and how work makes us unwell or equally allows us to thrive and flourish. And as someone who enjoys working with data, any opportunity to collect and analyze data, I find stats quite interesting. So I think that gives me a basis to look at, well, you know, how does actually health and well-being impact different aspects of the workplace? And when we think about in the context of the well-being of nurses and midwives, you know, at its core, it's clearly a moral. There's a moral case for it. It's an ethical case. We should care because we should care. But in the context of an environment where resources are stretched or unavailable, or we're talking about needing to prioritize, how do we create a rationale or a justification that actually, you know, we need a little bit more resources over here, and how can we influence the allocation of resources? So really, this is what this chapter is about, to help us to understand how we might understand the cost of well-being, the different aspects of that, and how we might maybe, you know, have some approach to this in terms of having some rough calculations. But broadly speaking, within the chapter, we talk about 3 different areas: the cost to the workforce, the cost to the patient, and then ultimately the cost in terms of finances. And we know in terms of the workforce, we've heard allusions to that already this morning in terms of sickness absence and implications of that. That means you've got fewer staff on the wards and working with patients. And that, of course, over a longer period of time will have a knock-on effect as well, because that just places more pressure and demand on everyone else. Quite closely linked to that is actually that there's a strong link to presentism. If you're not familiar with this, it's the notion that we go into work then perhaps when we're unwell, when we're not 100% fit, when we should perhaps be better off at home recuperating. And there's lots of pressure and there's lots of reasons as to why a nurse or a midwife might come into work when they're not feeling completely well, and one of the strongest drivers of that is not wanting to let their patients and their colleagues down. But we also know from research that actually when individuals are unwell and still going to work, that when that places a physical toll on that individual, and that if that individual does eventually go off work sick, that they actually spend a longer period of time off sick because they're in a poorer state than they were before. And equally, there's lots of good research demonstrating that healthcare workers who are unwell are also a source then of transmission of viruses on wards, and clearly that's not something that we will want to see happen. And in the third aspect, in terms of the cost to the workforce, is in terms of turnover, and that's clearly a very salient issue that everyone is grappling with at the moment. In terms of cost to the patient, again, we see evidence both with nurses, midwives, but also within the wider healthcare workforce in terms of staff who are unwell and not being associated with medical errors, and also not being able to provide the level of care that an individual might want to be able to provide. And not being able to provide that level of care then is associated with feelings of compassion fatigue, burnout, and also moral injury later on. And it's not just at the level of the individual nurse or midwife, but actually when we look at groups of people who are struggling, that has a knock-on effect on performance at a unit level. So things like mortality rates and infection rates and patient satisfaction at the level of a ward or a department or even at a trust. And that, of course, is concerning. There is, however, a caveat within it that the research is not completely clear, and that sometimes we don't find this relationship, and that's often the working hypothesis is around that is that actually when staff are unwell, that they rather than allow patients to be affected, you bring so much more of yourself to work, and that in turn, places an additional demand on that individual. You give so much more extra of yourself to ensure that patient care is not affected, but that toll again over a longer period of time is not going to be sustainable. The final aspect, we talk about the cost in terms of finances, and here we break down and distinguish between the direct cost. So this might be things like what's the cost of sickness absence, what you might spend on agency fees, on bank costs, costs in terms of medication, for example. There's also an indirect cost. So what's the cost of productivity? Maybe your staff, yourself, your colleagues might be going into work, but what actually is the knock-on effect in terms of productivity as well? And finally, there's an intangible cost as well. And how do we quantify the emotional cost that of individuals who might be struggling, of teams who might be even traumatized about the experiences of their own health and well-being, or that of their peers? So really, to summarize this chapter, what we have is we've got an activity where we provide some suggestions in terms of what data you might want to look for, how you might want to go about just doing some rough calculations and trying to cost it out. And that's actually where we invite you to actually see, what is the cost of you perhaps being off sick, or if not yourself, of a colleague or of an entire team perhaps. And we also have the case study which put together by Liz Wood using an example from Mid Yorkshire Hospital, where they talked about creating a cost argument to ask for more staff to support occupational health provision within that specific trust, and really drawing on the statistic that actually there's good data from the King's Fund showing that for the average trust, the 1% reduction in sickness absence actually equates to £1 million in terms of savings. And that is quite a substantial saving that can be generated. So in a nutshell, that's an overview of the chapter, and I hope that gives some useful ways to think about how you might want to perhaps create an argument if that is something that you need to do in the context that you're in.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was really interesting. I was really pleased to be a co-author on that chapter as well. I think it's one of the things that's often forgotten is that actually all of these examples of best practice, they do consider that, it needs a top-down investment from the organisation, and that can be costly. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to present a business case, if you like, to organisations as to why that's viable and why it's important. So we know that investing money in work and health and wellbeing programmes across the board, across all occupational groups, is a really important thing to do. So you can read a bit more about the processes of that in the chapter that Kevin's led. So thank you very much. That's really important. We have only a few minutes left in this session. So one thing that I just wanted to do is to just note that across the board, there's been a couple of key points that have come out across all of these presentations. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic as a contemporary crisis has put unprecedented disruption and pressure on the nursing and midwifery workforce, and of course across all occupational groups. And that's reinforced the importance of protecting wellbeing across health and care services. But it's really important to recognise, as Jill Mayburn mentioned at the beginning, that health and wellbeing has always been an issue. It's just been thrown into the limelight, if you like, by the COVID pandemic. And we must recognise that sustained and embedded wellbeing strategies need to be an organisational priority. So as Kevin says, we need to invest money in organisational wellbeing, and it should not simply be a reactive remedial response to a crisis. So that's one point, the impact of COVID-19. Another key point is that there doesn't seem to be a one-size-fits-all approach to employee wellbeing, and strategies need to be targeted to the organisation and the needs of the workforce across job roles, across levels of experience, cultures and different communities. We need to remember that the health and care workforce is diverse. It's made up of multiple races, ages, genders, ethnicities and orientations. And it's really important in thinking about wellbeing that we recognise this diversity and create equality of opportunity for nurses and midwives. And I think the presentations by Rohit and Louise and Aqualine really shed light on this. So we need to recognise diversity, create equality of opportunity, and give everybody in the workforce opportunity to achieve their full potential. And that will ultimately improve patient care. So the second point was there isn't a one size fits all, and we need to look at the diversity. And I think this book is a great example of how we can draw examples of best practice across lots of different groups and settings and apply them to our own organisations. The final point that I wanted to make is that these chapters have shown us that the success of health and wellbeing strategies depends critically on organisational culture. So while we have some really valuable chapters in the book, we've not got presenters here today talking about it, but we've got mechanisms for looking after your own physical well-being, hydration, physical activity, healthy diet, and so on. And we've of course had Joe here today talking about managing emotions in difficult times. And we've also got some great chapters. There's a chapter led by Holly Starbuck on starting conversations about mental health, which I think is really important. So it's actions that we can take as individuals to protect our well-being. But it does depend on having that organisational culture in place that refers to shared values, expectations and practices that guide and inform our actions and the actions of all team members. And that means we need to clearly prioritise the workforce across organisations, and there needs to be a robust organisational framework that supports employee well-being. Importantly, as I mentioned, Holly Starbuck's chapter, a culture where people can speak openly about their mental health. So having that psychological safety within the organisation so people can actually tell people when there's an issue or make suggestions for change. And importantly, the buy-in of senior leaders that sets the precedence for a healthy workforce from the top down. And that's really, really important. No man is an island, as it were, and everybody has some kind of contribution to the well-being of themselves, their peers, and others, and all of that will ultimately influence on the economic cost of running the NHS and the quality of patient care, as well as the workforce health and well-being. So it's really important. So we know that leaders also need to champion health and well-being and take action when it's needed. And again, just referring back to the chapter around starting conversations about mental health, there's also a lot of recommendations within that chapter for actions that individuals can take themselves, but also line managers and wider trust management teams to advocate and raise awareness, reduce stigma around mental health, and advocate open conversations about mental health in the workplace setting. So we're coming towards the end of our time here, and I just wanted to say on behalf of myself and Gemma, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the 36 contributors to this text, and we hope this will be a really, really valuable book that will give examples of best practice across different sectors, sizes, types, across all different settings and services, and we hope that you'll be able to apply some of the learning there at whatever level, from student through to chief executive. We hope that this will be useful. So we just wondered if it was possible to hand over now to Professor Greta Westwood, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Florence Nightingale Foundation. It would be really nice to hear a final word from Greta. If she's here. Yeah, there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Crikey, what a 2 hours, I have to say. I paid attention to my emotional well-being this morning in my little run, and I was running around. I was thinking about this morning and the tidbits that I would glean from the contributions of all of the authors in this book. And as every contributor went through their chapter, I kept thinking, yes, marvellous, breathing, come on, breathe, Greta, got that. I'm obviously very old, so I love the chapter on paying attention to the emotional and well-being of the older nurse and midwife, and how that's really important. And as everybody spoke, it seemed relevant. Everything seemed relevant to me. So I think as audiences today, I'm hoping that you've picked up something from each of those chapters. I I will definitely fly the flag for this book, and I know that Gemma's mentioned that there is a discount on buying this book. And in the very last second, I want to say thank you so much to both Gemma and Holly for getting together your brains and the brains of the contributors to this book, and in record time producing a book that is not just a book, but it's a handbook. It's one of those books that you have on your shelf and you can pick up again. And of course, my team, those behind the scenes. We have Adam, who's been pressing slides, and other members of the team who have contributed to this Zoom, arranging this Zoom call for everyone today, and our engagement team who do so well in the social media promotion of all of our webinars. So I'm not sure if I forgot the last word, Gemma. I always like the last word, but I'll let you have it because you two are the stars here. But thank you so much to you two again, all the contributors, everybody who's listened to this webinar this morning. And I'd like to see this book in the top list of the Times Times books. But hey, that's me. So back to you two. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Greta. And we should say as well that a contribution of the royalties from the books will be obviously fed straight into the Florence Nightingale Foundation and will help us to do more of the phenomenal work that we do as an organisation. Just before we go, I'd love for everyone that's contributed to today's webinar to pop their cameras on to give everybody a wave that's out there in the audience and say a really huge thank you to everybody that's contributed today, all of our authors that have contributed to the book, and Holly for being my absolute superstar partner in crime in bringing this vision to a reality. Thank you all, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.